Now I will start a recording, and as well. So, hey everyone. So, yeah, thanks a lot for coming to our regular education session. And I'm Dr. Chen Ben. I'm the educational coordinator of a PSL, and thanks a lot for everybody joining us. And today we're very lucky that we invited Dr. Stephen Moffic to talk about culture, racism in mental health, which I think it's a quite important topic, especially nowadays. And we also possibly will touch upon the physician burnout issue, if we have extra time. I think everybody saw our email about a brief by sketcher about it, Dr. Moffic. Dr. Stephen Moffic is a professor of psychiatry at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He is also an editorial member of Psychiatry Times. I think a lot of people are reading that as well. Dr. Moffic is the recipient of many distinguished awards, including Hero of Public Psychiatry in 2002 by APA, and also Psychiatrist Administrator Award in 2016 by both APA and AAPA, which is the American Association of Psychiatrist Administrators. So Dr. Moffic has his main interest in ethics, culture, racism, and physician burnout. I think that Dr. Moffic has been working on this project for 50 years by now, and I had a lot of experience on that. And he's also a award-winning writer, and he has written many books on these topics. And a lot of on Amazon or in the library you can read. A lot of things to read. So Dr. Moffic is also regularly talking on national media to educate the public about psychiatric topics. So we're very lucky today to have him with us to give us the lecture. And I also want to let everybody know today's lecture format is a little bit different compared to our old ones. Previous ones we always have the lecturer to give a formal lecture at the beginning. So then it will be a Q&A session. But this time will be more interview type. So it's more interactive. And although I'm the host and will be the main interviewer, but we definitely encourage everyone to raise your hand or mute yourself and to ask a question directly to Dr. Moffic. We welcome this kind of message. And although this is new, but I think it will be very interesting and interactive, especially it's a topic I think a lot of people have a question to ask, and it's very relevant to our current situation. So let's start. Dr. Moffic, first I want to personally thank you for your support to myself. When I first share my experience about the peer support work at the Wuhan Project, via the AACP, which is the American Association of Community Psychiatry email list. I believe you were the first one to give me support, and your encouragement really inspired me to share this experience in the Facebook group, where I met Mona and many others, including our community members, Smita, Allison and Susan. So, which led to the establishment of the PSL in the late of March, and it's been already a few months. We grew a lot bigger. We just mentioned about it. We have like over 700 volunteers, and we're really proud of that. And I just mentioned that we were just recently recognized by APA officially as the resource for physicians who's in this pandemic and under a lot of mental stress. So I really appreciate your support, and I greatly appreciate your time in this weekend to share with us your experience.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'm honored to see you and meet you because I think your work was astounding. And I also think the work of this physician support group is just astounding. So you all are just picking up a deficit that's existed and doing it in such a compassionate and free way so that people can use it easily. So you're just filling such an important void nowadays. So my appreciation to you and the rest of the people involved.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I want to emphasize, without our volunteers' support, we'll not be able to go this far. I think our volunteers are really the heroes. In this pandemic, not only themselves, they have their own full-time job. They themselves, I think these kind of triple things. First is that then themselves in this pandemic, they worry about their own health and their family's health. But second thing is that they are actually taking care of their patients, and who's stressed by this pandemic. And third, and they're volunteer in PSL helping our colleagues. And so I really appreciate them, for that. And and Dr. Moffic, you just shared with me your recently published article on Psychiatry News about Psychiatrist, the hero in pandemic. I think it's very related, to what I was just said. So I wonder if you can comment on these things.
Okay, and probably first I'll just recognize a hero in society who just died, which is John Lewis, the representative who is a lion as far as activism goes, as far as racism goes, as far as being a hero for 50 years himself. And I don't want to associate myself with him in any sort of way, but his death is a big loss. In fact, maybe take a moment, because I want to read you his sort of this might be his last public statement. This was done on June 7th, and he was interviewed, and he said this, quote, "Despite real progress, I can't help but think of young Emmett meaning Emmett Till. I can't think of young Emmett today as I watch video after video after video of unarmed Black Americans being killed and falsely accused," he said. "My heart breaks for these men and women, their families, and the country that let them down." Again, he continued, "My fellow Americans, this is a special moment in our history. Just as people of all faiths and no faith and all backgrounds, creeds, and colors banded together decades ago to fight for equality and justice in a peaceful, orderly, nonviolent fashion, we must do so again." So honor to him, really. And what I wanted to say about psychiatrists who potentially were heroes is this. The frontline medical physicians, especially on the ICU, sometimes in the emergency room, have gotten a lot of renown during the pandemic, in essence, putting their lives more online to provide help, and sometimes with inadequate supplies and so forth. And I started with the psychiatrists who have died during the pandemic. Actually, 3 of them were already elderly and retired, but 1 wasn't. And this psychiatrist in New York City worked until he died in the hospital, even took his computer with him and kept in touch with patients because he said, they need me. I have to save their lives. And by the way, this isn't published yet. It'll come out in Psychiatric News in the next edition, I believe. And then there was one psychiatrist who was kind of my mentor a long time ago, named Andrew Slaby, and he died of the coronavirus also. He wasn't that old. But the ones that really got my attention that I thought should be heroes, they also mainly come from Yale. That's my medical school, and that's why I know more about it, because I hear about it as an alumni. And a lot of the younger psychiatrists, whether they were residents or early career psychiatrists, were called upon to serve, many of them on the front lines of medicine, assisting other physicians, even in the ICU, general medical services. And they, again, were putting their lives on the line and even stretching sort of what they knew, but trying to learn very rapidly what they didn't know to help such people. So I kind of deemed all these people as being heroes of psychiatry, but I tried to kind of reframe what heroes meant. We tend to think of them as doing extraordinary things under risk to themselves. And there's another definition that can be used, which is when you speak up and talk about things that aren't popular, and when you do so, it's at risk really to your career to do so. I think that's another kind of heroism, and really important in these times of the pandemic and racism and all the other things now. And I think psychiatrists tend not to speak up, certainly not speak up in society, but sometimes even in our own professional circles. And I think we need to do more of that.
Thanks, Dr. Moffic. I think I just shared a picture of Representative John Lewis, who passed, yesterday. So, I think he's a prominent name, in this country's history, for civil rights movement, and also I think, psychiatrists also, sacrificed quite a bit in this, COVID, pandemic, as Dr. Moffic just mentioned. Personally, myself, I have two colleagues, and they're, contracted the illness, and thankfully, they actually recover from that, which is pretty good. But I think I saw on the AP website that they actually have a list of our colleague who passed away due to this pandemic. I think psychiatrists might not be frontline as a ER doctor or ICU doctor, but we're not like sitting at a back office at all. I think we're also at the front line, try to help our patients as well. So yeah, I think that's the spirit of our medical society as well. So when mentioned about John Lewis, again, he's a prominent figure of the civil rights movement in this country. So Dr. Moffic, as you've been concentrated on this area for 50 years, it's much, even before I was born, I would say. So do you see a difference? What is the progress in your perspective that, how these, racism issues have that improved or progress, comparing to at that 50 years ago and now? So 50 years is not a long time, but it's not a short time. So what kind of progress we have made in this country, as you can see?
Yes, I think that's a really important question too, because you hear so often nowadays, nothing's changed as far as racism goes. Everything's still just as bad. Nothing's changed. I hate to say it, but you hear that a lot from young people who weren't around in the 1960s, say. So 50 years ago was 1970, that was sort of the end of the civil rights era, where some of the laws were passed and so forth. It was a very conflictual, very violent time during the 60s. What's going on now doesn't compare to that at all. So what we're going through is kind of pale in comparison, which is an advance just in and of itself, that there's not so much violence now. Although, of course, the violence we're talking about to blacks by police is there. Anyways, in the 1960s, 1970, there were hardly any black psychiatrists, for instance. They were just emerging. They were just starting to talk about microaggressions, misdiagnosis of black males, say as paranoid schizophrenia, when they might have had an affective disorder. All that was just emerging. And a cohort of black psychiatrists continued to develop during the 70s. I myself, during the late 1970s, I was at Baylor College of Medicine, and I was asked to teach a course in cultural psychiatry there. Why did they ask me? When I came there, I said, I'm interested in underserved groups. Black population was very heavy in Houston, so were Hispanics, so were Hmong, and we had an anthropologist, and I said, sure, yeah, I'd love to. This is really important to me. And in one of the earlier classes was a young black male psychiatrist, and we developed a cultural psychiatry series. The most important part of it, I thought, was us talking about our own cultural identities and what that meant to us and how that influenced our patient care interactions. And actually at Yale, that they teach cultural psychiatry now, they do the same thing. So this has some lasting value. Anyways, he and I developed this curriculum, and it became a model for psychiatry residencies. And over the years, it's been embellished and developed and so forth. So psychiatry is moving in the right direction. I think more minorities of all types enter the field. Myself, I sort of drifted away from racism per se over time, in part because it looked like Black psychiatrists were kind of taking over developing that area, as they should. So I kind of dropped back, but did a lot of work with refugees in Wisconsin later on. That was sort of my cultural psychiatry work. And I was trying to find out, did any white psychiatrists sort of stick with working on racism over all these years, the last 20, 30 years? And really there hasn't been. You know, we've kind of pulled back white psychiatrists for better or worse. So up to the present, so Psychiatric Times, which has been a pretty white-oriented publication, not integrated very much, asked me, do you want to do an article centering on racism in psychiatry? I'm on their editorial board and I write a lot for them. And I thought, yeah, I do, but I don't want to do it myself because I don't know if I could do it well enough. And I don't know if I'm going to be criticized because Black psychiatrists will think they should be taking the lead on this, which sort of makes sense. But personally, I think this needs to be a multicultural effort. So what I did is try to line up a multicultural group of psychiatrists. So we ended up with 2 male Black psychiatrists, 2 female Black psychiatrists, and young Indian from India psychiatrist who just graduated residency, and a half Jewish, half Christian psychiatrist. And so we put together this article on racism in psychiatry that's going to come out in Psychiatric Times as a cover story in August. Actually, the most interesting part about it, the process to me, was what we went through briefly, because I think this shows some of the tensions and potential conflicts in working together on this. So we started off and we were just going to put together sort of a general review article on racism from a psychiatric perspective, which of course we could talk what that consists about. But anyways, we couldn't agree. Each of us would take a shot at developing different sections or pulling it all together, and we just couldn't agree. And I don't know whether it was we couldn't quite trust each other at that time, but I said, okay, this isn't working and we don't have much time. Why don't we do this instead? Each of you pick a topic that's really important to you as far as racism goes, and that could be police brutality, the development of children, whatever. Having more Black psychiatrists, more Black leaders. And so each of us did. And we did these in 250 words and stuff. That went really smoothly. We came back and said, okay, we need a little introduction and a little conclusion, you know, to kind of pull it together. That went as smooth as possible. It was like all the mistrust, all the potential conflict was gone. And then we sent it to the editor. The editor said, this is great. This is really moving. We want more. So we were asked to double the words of this article, which has never been done before. So it ended up being a collaboration, which took a lot of work and a lot of massaging, but I think it came out well. And also for the first time, Psychiatric Times is going to post the pictures of the authors. Now, why did I ask them to do that, to make an exception? I said, well, skin color is the first thing, and how we look, that's the first thing that elicits racial responses. And let's show who we are and what we look like to the readership. So that's also going to be added on.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to have a picture, you know, so, you know, a picture, you know, more than 1,000 words, right?
Yeah.
It has a, you know, it showed the the meaning of these, this article. That's the article you mentioned about that by the group, which you call the 7 Psychiatrists Against Racism.
Yeah, we call it SPAR. That's the acronym, 7 Psychiatrists Against Racism.
I see. And they were coming out in August, right?
Coming out in August. A bunch of the individual psychiatrists, especially the Black ones, have already had separate pieces posted about their viewpoint about racism on Psychiatric Times. So that could be looked at and found. One of them is a poet, writes these really powerful poems about racism. So people can look for that too.
I see. Looking forward to it. I think you mentioned a very important part of it. I think for our actual purpose, because we're more focused on the racism or the culture issues in the mental health field, and I think it might be divided by 2 parts. I think a lot of people possibly experienced some racism, during the work encounter patient like myself. I've been called slant eyes and Chinaman many times by the patients, but although majority of the time, later on they will apologize to me, but this is something, I'm kind of consider is kind of common in my normal practice, so, but another side is that these concealed racism or in some way the culture insensitivity in our own system, in our profession. So I'm glad, well, at least from my point of view, I think that improved quite a bit. I think for example, the current AMA president is a Black female psychiatrist, and then and the next actually, in the next lecture we'll have the next weekend, then we'll actually invite Dr. Gina, who's a Black female psychiatrist, to give us a lecture regarding her point of view. I think that will, it's from a different angle. I think that will be also useful. So, but this is not something like the culture issues and and the racism is inside our own specialty or inside of our own medical society. It's not something openly talked about compared to other things, right? So and a lot of people don't have a good intake on that and don't have a clear picture about it. So Dr. Moffic, what's your opinion on that? Because again, this is not a topic openly we see it on the national television, anything like that. So what's your intake on that?
Yes, I think that's really important matter, from both sides. I think patient care cross-culturally is still an issue we have to improve. Psychiatry in general has improved in how they evaluate and treat patients of various culture, but whatever new studies there are, they still show a ways to go. And the same in general medicine. It isn't different with psychiatry. But what the important part that I think you're also bringing up is how psychiatrists and other physicians and other mental health caregivers of any discipline, how they're viewed from a cultural standpoint, both by other psychiatrists, white psychiatrists say, but also patients. And there's so many painful stories about the kind of example you said of how you're kind of demeaned by certain patients because of your cultural background without them getting to know you, because once they get to know you and accept you, you do a great job. But sometimes it can never reach that stage. And I think there's various ways to try to deal with that. If you have supervision of somebody who's capable culturally, that can help. If you have a buddy that you can talk to about this sort of stuff, that helps. I think you have to take these kind of confrontations with a little grain of salt and try to wait it out. But I always thought, I still do, if you have a system where there's enough diversity in the staff, and there should be, because that's one of the things to look at from the standpoint of institutional racism. Do you have kind of the same representation, more or less, of staff as you do in society that you're drawing patients from. Anyway, so when a patient comes in, I thought that they should always be asked, do you have a preference in who you want to see? Whether that be a man, woman, older, younger, of a different culture. And if you could meet their requests, great. But I think just asking them in the first place tends to kind of break the ice in case you can't meet their request. But I think, you know, if you still have to see somebody that doesn't want to see you, then it takes our skills of building an alliance and kind of trying to wait out the animosity, because oftentimes it's a great learning experience for the patient as well as ourselves to go through that. But it, you know, it's really important. And I want to bring up a little study that has to do with burnout, in case we never get to burnout, because it has to do with racism. This was a study, about a year ago in JAMA, a really very good study, maybe of 3,000 residents across all disciplines. And it was to try to kind of compare burnout and racism over a period of time. How did one affect the other? So this was a year ago. They found high rates of burnout developed over time. No surprise there, up to maybe 50% to some significant degree. But what did they find out about these non-Black residents as far as their own racism? Well, as the burnout increased, their racism increased at the same time, using implicit bias tests and a couple other measurements. So physicians who are burning out, and these again are non-Black physicians, would tend to get more racist. So it just kind of compounds that problem of burnout, because it makes things worse from a cultural side as far as racism goes. It was really striking to me when I first read this. I was a little bit surprised, but then not surprised. It sort of makes sense, because when you burn out, you're just not as empathetic and you're kind of emotionally wrought. And I think whatever racism is under the surface there, it makes it easier to be drawn out. So burnout's a problem that needs to be solved to help racism go away within medicine and psychiatry.
Okay, got it. So we have a participant, one of our volunteers have a question. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was talking to somebody else saying about to ask a question, keep it quiet. But hi, my name is Anandi. I'm a child psychiatrist in Los Angeles. And I had a question, doctor, about your point on things have gotten a lot better since the civil rights time and all that. And my worry is, in the time that we're in, is that people haven't eliminated their biases. They just got a little better at concealing them. So they know not to use certain words and stuff, but they're still supporting policies and even in, or engaging in microaggressions that are harmful to people of color. And I also, so I wanted you to talk about that a bit, about this whole concealed racism, one. And then secondly, like I find I develop quite a bit of countertransference in my private practice when I do have some affluent, elite white patients, because a lot of times I'll feel like they act as if I work for them, like I'm running a customer service business, or and and I get a little irritated after a while. Like I still take, the children, I care for them, and I want to help them, and I think rich children can have more emotional deprivation than poor children sometimes, but so we have a lot here in LA, but like I find that I shy away from it. I'll shy away from taking patients sometimes because I can only handle so much of that. So so on a personal note, if colored psychiatrists feel more comfortable dealing with colored patients, I don't think that's great either. So how does one like me navigate that?
Yeah, it is kind of tricky, and I'm glad you brought up counter-transfers, because some of it is our own issue to deal with, and then the patient has their own issues about racism and culture. And, sometimes that issue has very little to do with what they're coming into treatment for. So if the issue can be sort of ignored, you can still help quite a bit. But if there's a way to process that, especially if that issue is somehow intertwined with the problem they're coming in for, it could be helpful for both sides. I think probably with almost all of the Black patients I ever saw, sooner or later, we talked about our cultural differences and how we viewed each other and trusted each other. But that wasn't at the beginning. That took some amount of time to work through. I think from the patient standpoint, especially, let's talk about Black patients there, I think at least right now, the more they can see Black clinicians, the better, because there's so much mistrust that has been built up in the Black community about medicine and psychiatry that they're better off seeing a Black clinician. Maybe, hopefully 20 or 30 years from now, maybe that won't be true. Now, there was a group, and there still is a group, that thinks white psychiatrists are better than Black psychiatrists. That somehow we've been better educated or we're smarter. And that's why I think it's good to give patients a choice, if that's available, of who they want to see. But I think, you don't want this to sap you of energy, so not to take so many patients where you can assume this is coming up is good. But if it can be talked about, potentially it's good for both you and the patient. But if it's separate from the problem they're coming in for, that's not necessarily a necessity. You started off with, in a way, talking about society, and I think you're right, if I understood what you were getting at. I mean, on the one hand, we had a Black president of the United States, which was a major advance in and of itself, but did that matter for the general population? I'm not sure. And then there was a backlash with that. So part of the backlash is that we have President Trump, and clearly with many of his supporters, there's overt racism. It's not even hidden anymore. It's just out there. So how much advances have we made in society? I think we've made them in pockets. But I think it is more out in the open now. And what's so hard to do is to maintain a focus on this over time, because I think what happened after the 60s, things did improve some in the 70s and 80s, and then it was just sort of forgotten about. And we had these advances, but we forgot what was still lurking in the background that probably still had to be worked on. So no matter what we do now in the next few months, whether it's adjusting police departments and so forth, are we just gonna then go into a lull again, and then things will kind of simmer waiting for the next crisis? So whatever we're gonna do about this has to be maintained. I do think there has been a lot of advances in medicine and psychiatry, though. I mean, watching the young psychiatrists who are interviewed on the media about their experience on the front lines of the pandemic has just been eye-opening. There's so much diversity there. It just fills my heart with joy to see that. You wouldn't see any diversity if you were picking out young psychiatrists, in the 1960s and 70s. There was virtually none. So at least there's been advances in cultural groups entering medicine and psychiatry, somewhat in leadership. That's the institutional racism that has to be changed, but there's definitely been advances there, but much more yet to do. So I don't know if that covered some of what you brought up, but if not, tell me and I'll
yeah, I just feel like, and I think there's a lot of sensationalism that we sometimes latch onto with news and stuff. But I feel like, we kind of live in a time where somebody will fervently say, I'm not racist, while saying racist things. We have leaders who are doing that now. And it's quite concerning to me that that is so becoming so normalized.
Yeah, they sort of give lip service to it, but almost because they have to, for PR sake, but do they really mean it? And are they going to follow through in any way that's actually useful? The action is what's really important too. So yeah, we might be getting fooled by all of these statements of we're going to do something to change our organizations and institutions, and actions will speak as loud as words here. But yeah, I think you're picking up on something concerning.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Dr. Bernadine, yeah, you can ask. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Moffic. I was just curious when and thank you for your work all these years, by the way. I've been reading what you write for many, many years.
Thank you.
About the white psychiatrists who think they're better than a non-white psychiatrist, which is, it's real, but it's flabbergasting. But do you know who they are? I mean, I'm curious if it's a generational thing, if it's depends where they live, depends of the age, of the sex. Do you have any idea? And is it still as prevalent in the younger generations than before? I just want to know if you have an idea about that.
Any idea about, say that again, any idea about
who are in general? You mentioned, white psychiatrists thinking they're better, and I'm curious if they are more older psychiatrists, if it's a generational thing, if it depends which state they work, which university they went to. I'm just curious if you have an idea.
Well, I mean, going back to the time I started to work in psychiatry, the early 70s, late 70s, there was a cadre of white psychiatrists who were concerned. In fact, probably the most notable one was Mel Sapshin, who ended up becoming the CEO of the APA for many years. But before he became president, he wrote an astounding article in American Journal of Psychiatry, I think from 1970, saying all the things that we're talking about again. And he had some other white colleagues he worked with. And there was a society called the Society for the Study of Psychiatry and Culture, also mainly white psychiatrists who were concerned about cultural matters. And then there was this cadre of black psychiatrists that started to develop at the same time. And for a period, we kind of worked together. But the white psychiatrists sort of fell back, for a variety of reasons. I think we weren't necessarily as welcome anymore, that the psychiatrists of other cultural groups said, okay, we're here, we can work on this now. We'll call on you for help when we need to. And so many of us ended up doing other things. They could still be culture related, like I did with refugees, but nevertheless, it was different going into other areas than we were before. So recently I was trying to find any white psychiatrists left that have still been really concerned about racism, and I could find virtually nobody, and include myself. I sort of blame myself for kind of drifting away also, because I think, as I said, ultimately, I think the more we can work together about this, the better. Although I think if you take racism per se, I think it is better if black psychiatrists take the lead when they can or when they feel comfortable, but not to do it like, oh, this is just an issue for black psychiatrists and we're going to work on it, and it doesn't matter if other psychiatrists of other cultures join us or not. I don't think that'll be helpful in the long run.
And thank you. And maybe I didn't express one part of my question was, I was curious, since we speak a lot about structural racism now, and you mentioned racist white psychiatrists, I'm curious how much you've seen that in the past. That would be part of the APA or part of, the people determining some policies. And if you've seen a change in that, is at the level of the APA, for instance, there is still some discrimination, or if things have changed during the years?
Yeah, if we talk about sort of the three levels of racism: the structural racism, which goes across all of society going back 400 years, affects education, medicine, business, so on and so forth. There's remnants of racism apparently, supposedly everywhere, and I think there is.
Yeah.
Then you get to institutional racism, where you're talking about a certain system. So there we can talk about institutional racism as far as, say, psychiatry goes. And then personal racism, you know, what degree of racism might you or I have? I actually think the personal racism is the least important. But it's institutional racism in our field is crucial. So let's take, when did we first have a Black psychiatrist as president of the APA? A couple of years back, Altha Stewart. It took a long, long time. This was after Obama when she became president. So was that a signal or sign of racism in psychiatry? We had a assistant CEO of diversity in the APA. She's gone, and that disappeared a year ago, and it hasn't been filled. What does that mean? Does that mean that's another sign of racism in psychiatry? Now, our current president, who will only be a president for a year, is trying to do a lot about racism. He's having town hall meetings and so forth. But in my point of view, I've noticed there's only Black psychiatrists so far as part of those town hall meetings. So again, kind of not an integrated point of view. So we still don't have enough Black psychiatrists to represent the public. That needs to be beefed up, the same in medicine. So I think if that got worked upon more and continued to be a focus, that's even more important than us looking at ourselves. But I think all psychiatrists should try to look at themselves from the standpoint of culture and racism. Do I have it? Should I take an implicit bias test? Let me ask a Black colleague, do you think I'm racist in any way? And try to develop from that. You know, probably psychiatrists on the whole are on more liberal side. Certainly if we take an organization like the American Association of Community Psychiatrists, that's a liberal group of psychiatrists for sure. You know, maybe there's 1,000 of them and there's 35,000 psychiatrists or more. And that group is certainly liberal, and probably none of them would say they're overtly racist, but I think they also realize there's some underlying racial issues they need to deal with, or at least work to improve in their work settings and society. So I think the institutional racism is the most important to put an emphasis on now. You know, we can't really, as individuals, even as a psychiatric organization, we really can't do a whole lot about the structural racism in the whole country. I mean, we should try to contribute our ideas to that, but it's the institutional racism. I think that's the key.
And about all minorities, I think also.
Yes, all minorities, you know.
There's so more diverse.
Yes, all minorities, you know. I think the most discriminated group in the United States, in my personal opinion, is not even necessarily Black Americans, it's Native Americans. Most discriminated group of all, in all sorts of medical and psychiatric ways. Plus, so many of them are on reservations outside of society. That's a key group. Hispanics are still a key group. Asian Americans, even though they're the representation in medicine and psychiatry is high, there's probably a higher percentage of Asian Americans, which consists of different groups, of course, but a higher percentage of them than people in society. Yet, you know, COVID comes up and Trump calls it the Chinese flu or Kung flu, and Asian psychiatrists and patients and physicians get hit with discrimination. So even being relatively overrepresented doesn't stop that sort of discrimination. So yeah, it's all groups other than so-called whites, you know.
Thank you.
And especially men.
Thanks. So yeah, it's a very profound question. So that make me think right now we're under pandemic. It's already put a lot of people under stress. But and it somehow kind of even flare up the culture, conflict and the racism issues. So to be more related to our work over here at the PSL, as we're mainly try to provide peer support to our frontline colleagues, who's possibly when dealing with patients and not only under a lot of stress but also to some degree might having more issue of or encounter more this racism or discrimination to some degree. Not only racism, of course, there's other issues like our colleagues who's in different gender, like a female colleagues, or the different sexual orientation, different religion, or even the different immigration status, like they're not citizen or so a lot of issues. So when they're facing a lot of stress and dealing overwhelming amount of patients and try to help them, when having a lot of confusion regarding the guidelines, and that's another issue. But nevertheless, that all things seems all flat up at the same time.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah. So, so Dr. Moffic, if you can give us some advice so that if, I'm not sure if any of our colleagues get a call regarding of this particular stress, situation from our callers, but Dr. Moffic, I just want to get some of your opinion, advice, how if we encounter a caller, having this kind of struggle, how we'll be able to help them. Thanks.
Yes, if anybody has, an example or experience, yeah, please share that with us. That might help. But, I think basically that you're there to help and they've made the call, you've already done a whole lot. I think probably most important is that you don't do anything that's going to make it worse, which means, it's so easy to make inadvertent statements in this racism climate that you don't even mean or misinterpreted. So I think, just being a good listener, being concerned, being compassionate, and if any obvious ideas come up to help, like finding a battle buddy, for instance. So, you can't solve these problems in a phone call, but that you're there to listen and help goes such a long way in itself. I was wondering actually, when somebody calls, how they get hooked up. Do they ask for a person of a psychiatrist of any particular background, or is there some kind of rotation? That kind of goes back to our prior question about whether a patient has a preference for a clinician of a certain background. Does that enter at all into, how somebody's hooked up with a psychiatrist?
Yeah. So, it's just a hypothetical question because I think our colleagues are possibly face a different level of stress. Like I said, we all know that minorities has a much higher, like a 2 or 3 times higher of represented percentage, contract COVID compared to the general population, for some reason, So, and like a doctor in this same minority group will possibly feel upset about this because his own, the same race and they see a much higher patient from his own community contract this virus and possibly put a lot of stress on this particular doctor. And the other things I don't know if it's a racial issue involved. Like I watched the news. There's I believe is Asian ER doctor was fired because he was talking about his reported hospital not providing enough PPE to the employees. But for that particular case, I'm not sure if a racial issue involved. But nevertheless, I think even for our callers, they possibly encounter these kind of issues in their daily life or in their daily work. So do you have any general advice on how we be able to handle this kind of situation better? Maybe just for ourselves, because although we're trying to help others, but we're in this pandemic as well, and ourselves under a lot of stress. So we need to protect our own mental health in that regard. So, do you have any advice regarding on this issue and how we be able to handle this better? Not only for ourselves, but also contributed to the better working environment, both for us, for our colleagues, and for our patients.
Yeah, probably at some point in time, maybe you all are going to want to write something or present something as a group to talk about your experience and share what you've learned or even what you're concerned about to kind of get it out there more. But for yourselves, I don't know if you do this sort of stuff, because I could sense, whether it's racism or other issues, this can be very difficult just with phone calls, with what you're hearing. And I thought before the pandemic started, one of the things that we should be doing more about burnout, say, is having support groups. The best one is called a Balint group, BALINT, which was designed to share patient-related problems, but it can be used just to share other kind of problems. Like if a group of you all got together, or many groups of you all got together online to talk about your experiences, especially with somebody who's familiar with a Balint group, or even just as familiar with group therapy per se, to talk about your experiences, share what's been troublesome, and you all may come up with solutions for each other. And the group leader could also, of course, help. I think if you do this just one-on-one and it's not processed at all, I think it's going to potentially pull your compassion a little too much, and you'll end up getting passion fatigue, if not frustration. So I would think about your large group trying to find ways to meet in small groups at times online. That's the beauty of online now, because you can meet from different areas of the country, and you can do this in one session. You could set up to have it done in 6 sessions. I'd be glad to help you if you want to do something like that over time. But I think you may need something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to make a couple of remarks, if I may. May I?
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so to end with a question, but just to address a couple of questions that Dr. Moffic has asked. First of all, just to let you know, the way that we work is we sign up for shifts, and each person signs up for a 1-hour shift over the course of, I think it's an 18-hour day or something of that stretch. So, where you happen to put yourself is the luck of the draw in terms of what particular psychiatrist a person gets when they call. So the caller doesn't have an option to say, can I speak to this kind of a psychiatrist or that kind of a psychiatrist? It's whoever was on duty. And the second thing is that we actually do meet once a week, every Wednesday evening, where we all gather together on Zoom, whoever wants to attend, to discuss the cases that we've seen during the week, that we've spoken with during the week, and very much provide that support. And there are many on that call, a number of very senior psychiatrists who have a great deal of seasoning and experience, who are often very, very helpful in terms of that process and giving feedback. Of course, have their own cases as well sometimes to discuss. So we actually are already up and running in that particular way. I don't think we have a formal Balint approach, but it certainly is a very, very useful approach. Now to my question. I wanted to know, Dr. Moffic, what you And by the way, I've not identified myself. This is Mark Comrade. And
Yeah, I know you, especially from the APA lists or members.
Exactly. We've corresponded a few times. So I wanted to know your thoughts about affirmative action as a tool, what your own personal experience with that is, and your thoughts about that as a tool for addressing institutional racism. What are your reflections on that particular tool?
Yeah, and by the way, I'm glad to hear what you're already doing as far as, you know, processing your work experience. And yeah, it sounds like you got a good start there. You know, it would be nice if somebody notices that there's, say, I don't know, a Black physician who's calling in and really wants to talk to another Black physician, and it's not a Black physician on the phone, whether somehow that option could be available afterwards. But anyways, that's a system issue to consider for yourselves. Yeah, I think the essence of affirmative action is important because it's one of the only ways to help get past any hidden or overt racism that's in the system. So, you know, in terms of medicine and psychiatry, whether you make that an informal process, which I guess it has to be nowadays, a priority should be paid to increase the pipeline of Black and other minority psychiatrists. And I think you even got to go back in time and try to get promising Black students from high school and college and build a pipeline up to medicine and psychiatry. So, because I think, you know, as far as I know, in the last 10 years or so, the percentage of, again, just to use Black psychiatrists because we're talking about racism, I think the percentage has flattened. And, you know, we're not increasing it, especially in psychiatry, to the level that's needed just to help Black patients in the community more. So, yeah, I think we do need something like that for certain groups.
Thank you. Thanks.
Welcome.
Okay, so so I think I asked most of my questions. You know, so it's already 1 o'clock. You know, any of our audience, if you have any, you know, further questions, you know, feel free to, you know, unmute yourself and ask Dr. Moffic directly. So Dr. Moffic, at the same time, we briefly touched the base regarding physician burnout issues. I know you have your new book just published regarding all these, right? Maybe you can give us some tips, you know, regarding all these.
Yeah, burnout's very difficult matter. Yeah, the book's by the APA publishing company. It's Combating Physician Burnout, the Role of Psychiatrists, something like that. So there's 3 co-editors of us and different people wrote chapters, and this came out of the APA work group on psychiatry and wellness, which is now a committee. And the committee, actually, speaking of racism, is supposed to be working on cultural issues as far as burnout, although nothing's come out yet, because we were wondering, are psychiatrists of different ethnic background more or less burned out than the average? But nothing's come out yet. But, you know, the APA's own survey about burnout, I think maybe 2,000 psychiatrists or so have filled it out, was extraordinarily worrisome. I think so worrisome that the APA hasn't publicized it. You know, using the instrument we used and the cutoff point we decided upon was like 75% of those who answered were burned out to a significant degree. Now, of course, they could have been self-selected, the ones who took the survey and so forth, but that was extraordinarily high. It was much higher than we expected. But, you know, if you look to what's out there for psychiatrists, it can range to 30%, 50%, plus or minus, not as high as some professions. But the APA hasn't been working very much on it, say, compared to emergency medicine, which has been working on burnout for 20 years, and their percentage seems to be going down. So the APA has to do more. But what makes burnout, I think, so difficult is that mainly it's a system issue. And it's a system issue that, simply put, has come about since about the year 2000 for physicians because of the intrusion of for-profit managed care, which made medicine more of a business. Profits would. Now I was a medical director of a big not-for-profit managed care system, so I kind of know this well. But for the for-profits, you know, the push to make money put patient care down low, which meant controlling what physicians were going to do, how much time we could spend with patients. And so we felt we weren't being true to our healing desires, you know, that we knew we could do more, but we couldn't in the systems. And that was the major cause of burnout. Plus, we weren't engaged by administrators. Like, we have this problem, we don't have enough funds. How can we all together figure out how to deal with it? That doesn't happen in systems that burn out their physicians, you know, and one solution is to have a chief wellness officer in your organization. That sounds promising, but as far as I know, it hasn't done much of anything because they don't have enough power. So maybe 80% of this variance comes from the system, you know, another 20% is us personally, and that's the part that you can try to do something about. It means taking care of your own wellness, whether that's exercise, sleeping, trying to get enough sleep, having somebody you could ventilate to, whether it's a loved one or a buddy at work. I think having a buddy at work is so, so important. Meditation helps, even briefly. And having hobbies, again, if you have the time to use them to get away from medicine. So, you know, you can help your own wellness and help to reduce burnout. The other tricky part about burnout, once you recognize you have it, and a good administrator will actually measure it periodically for those who work in the system. But anyways, the treatment is diffuse, and that's why I was mentioning the Balance group. You know, it's hard now to know how to help that other than to make the system better. So I was thinking about, well, what's happening during the pandemic then? Is burnout going up or down or staying the same? Well, number one, nobody much is measuring it. And why not? Because everybody's so busy adjusting to the new way of providing care. So it's like administrators say, I'm not going to take time, or researchers say, I'm not going to take time to do this. You know, we got these other more practical things. So nobody knows. On the one hand, if you're working a system and you're fulfilling what you think you can do to help, and you're saving somebody's life, that's just tremendously rewarding, and that prevents burnout. On the other hand, if you don't have the right equipment for your safety, if you're given a gag order not to talk about the problems where you work, that's what leads to burnout. My hunch is burnout's going up even more overall, but it probably varies a lot depending on the system. So, you know, I think we're stuck with this problem. It's, you know, complicated by the pandemic itself, you know, and then other issues like racism is popping up too. So we're in a very difficult time for physicians and psychiatrists as far as their own well-being. You know, I think we're going to have some delayed PTSD stuff, maybe not full-blown PTSD, but I think the trauma we're encountering in work situations is going to catch up some over time. So people have to watch for that within themselves, and maybe have their loved ones watch for any symptoms that emerge later than you might expect. Hopefully the suicide rate doesn't go up. It could.
Yeah.
I don't mean to sound negative. I mean to kind of warn people. This is something to pay attention to and to try to deal with as much as you can on yourselves. But it really, the biggest problem is having systems that won't cause burnout to be occurring so much.
Yes, I agree. You know, just, you know, although I'm not working in private practice, but I think, you know, it might be even a harder toll on the you know, our colleague working in private practice section, you know, or, you know, maybe in the other, you know, organization as well. They're part of the burnout nowadays, possibly not about they are worried about not enough productivity and losing patients and so on and so forth, unless they're having a heavy volume from telepsychiatry. That's another issue. So
yeah,
but
comment on that. That's really important. We actually tried to look at private practitioners versus psychiatrists working in institutions. There didn't seem to be much different in the rate of burnout because so many of the private psychiatrists were dealing with insurance stuff, which is one of the causes. But we hear of a movement now for more and more psychiatrists, especially those in private practice, but even those who are going into private practice, to just see patients who pay enough and not use insurance. Well, I mean, that's good for those patients and it's good for those psychiatrists, but what about all the other patients kind of left behind if that trend continues? It's understandable, but very worrisome trend, I think.
Yes, correct. Okay, so yeah, so it's already 11. Well, yeah, about 1:10. So I think we have a very wonderful session, and we had a lot of things to learn from Dr. Moffic. Thanks a lot of really appreciate your time, and thanks for all the audience. So for the I already recorded the whole session, so we're provided to our volunteer group. And for those who has not attended this lecture, for others who's willing to review it, and that'll also be a resource available. Again, thanks a lot for everyone's participation. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having it. Racism isn't an easy thing to talk about in any circumstance nowadays. So
yeah, it's a big topic.
Kind of brave to even make it a topic of attention. So
right, correct. Well, I think it's a good start for everyone, to realize that it's there, right? We all see it.
Yep.
Now we all have a lot of things to worry about nowadays, but there are this is a very indeed important topic we always need to keep in mind.
Yeah.
All right. Again, thanks a lot for Dr. Moffic. Regarding this lecture, we appreciate it. Especially for myself, I learned a lot. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you very much.
All right. Take care then.
Thank you.
All right.